So, picking up where we left off yesterday, which is the election of 1876. So, the election of 1876, the actual election day is November the 7th. Remember, that was Women's Day at the fair because women couldn't go out to vote anyways, so give them something to do. The thought was that, men wouldn't be interested in going to Women's Day at all, so who the heck cares? The election itself turns out to be really a combination of entertaining and frustrating. It is still the highest voter turnout ever in U.S. history. 81% of eligible voters took to the streets to vote. Now, any given normal election turnouts are usually like 55 to 60%. So, we've even had a couple of cases in the past couple of decades where it's been under 50%. 81% is a huge, huge voter turnout. When the votes are all said and counted, Samuel Tilden has a slight edge, approximately 200,000 votes. That's roughly about 3% of the total vote. The problem is that there's fraud and threats, if not outright violence, on both sides in various and sundry places. For example, in Oregon, which was controlled by Republicans, the Republican governor of Oregon actually invalidated, that's threw out an entire Oregon county's votes because he didn't like that they voted Democrat, which would have changed the outcome of the election in Oregon. But legally, under their constitution, he was able to do that under their voting rules. It's a little bit more complicated in the South, where you have everybody's favorite group of bigots and bed sheets sitting out in front of the polling places, intimidating blacks to prevent them from voting, sometimes committing violence against them to prevent them from voting, and helping, quote unquote, advise white voters to make sure that they were voting the way that they should be voting. When all was said and done, Tilden may have been ahead by 200,000 votes in the actual vote total, but in the Electoral College, which is where the state's votes are, Tilden was ahead by 19 votes. The problem is he was one vote short. 185 was the vote total you needed out of the Electoral College. Tilden had 184. Rutherford B. Hayes had 165. At issue are three southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Now, in fairness here, all three of those states, there was legitimate, provable voter fraud. The KKK was standing out in front of voting places. I mean, in all three of these states, the number of registered voters who were able to successfully vote was exceedingly low because they were sort of like um, going through and screening who was allowed to vote. So, legitimately, it could very easily be argued that these 20 electoral votes were legitimately sketchy. Tilden won the vote in all three states, but the Republicans who controlled the state government refused to let them be counted because of the blatant fact that there was voter fraud going on and intimidation at the polls. So, what do you do? Well, under the Constitution, when there is a question about the outcome of a presidential election, it is the House of Representatives that decides the election. Be technical, with each state getting one vote. The House decides that they are going to set up a committee. This committee will consist of 15 people. 7 of these people will be Republicans, 7 of these people will be Democrats. And to make things fair, the deciding vote will be one independent Supreme Court judge. This Supreme Court judge was actually independent. He was neither Republican nor Democrat. And it was going to be basically up to him to decide where these 20 votes went. If even one vote went to Tilden, he was automatically the winner. It would require all 3 states, all 20 votes, to go to Hayes for Hayes to win. Now, the Democrats were not convinced that this independent judge would be sympathetic to their position given the fact that, the Ku Klux Klan had pretty much prevented a good chunk of the populations of those three states from voting. So the Democrats decide to sort of try to pull a switch. Back in those days, senators were not elected, they were appointed by the states. And there was a vacancy in the state of Illinois for the Senate. Illinois was controlled by the Democrats. The Democratic governor and legislature of Illinois appointed this independent, non party affiliated Supreme Court justice as the new senator from Illinois. What they didn't realize is that this guy was so honest that he immediately stepped aside and said, I can no longer be on this committee because I'm now a Democrat, and that wouldn't be fair. Instead, the House of Representatives and their committee appoint an objective Republican. So, what do we mean by an objective Republican? It's a member of the Republican Party, but a guy who will look at the facts and make a decision based on facts, based on reality, based on the interests of the nation, not the interest of the Republican Party. And lo and behold, Hayes gets all 20 votes because bam, 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 by a vote of 8-7, the committee decides that all three states need to be given to Hayes. Hayes wins the electoral college by one vote while losing the popular vote by about 3%. So what the heck is going on here? Well, it's a little bit complicated and messy, but that's what we're going to talk about here. So this event is known as the Compromise of 1877. It is a secret agreement reached between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, the leaders of those two parties, not the regular rank and file members. So, what brings this about? Well, the real issue is that until the election is figured out, Grant will stay as president. And ain't nobody got time for that. So, at a really expensive New York hotel, the leaders of the Republican Party and the leaders of the Democratic Party show up for a dinner. And after dinner, they all sit down together and are having drinks and cigars, and they kind of talk out an agreement. Hayes will be allowed to win. The Democrats let Hayes win. In exchange, they get certain things. The Republicans agree to pull all the troops out of the South. This includes the southern states that had not yet ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments together, nor had they taken the oath of loyalty. It didn't matter. The Republicans are going to pull all the troops out of the southern states. Additionally, the Republicans are going to send money to rebuild the South in direct violation of the 14th Amendment. And they agree to run a Continental Railroad line through the southern city, a southern city someplace. Adding on to this, Hayes is going to appoint a Southern Democrat to his group of advisors, his presidential cabinet, so that the South will have a voice in Hayes's government. And by pulling out the troops, by not forcing them to ratify the Reconstruction Amendments, and by giving them money to rebuild and giving them a Continental Railroad, a transcontinental railroad, the Republicans basically agree that the South will be left to run its own affairs again, and they will not interfere. What the Republicans get is Hayes winning. What the Democrats get is the end of Reconstruction officially. And not just the end of Reconstruction, but essentially it basically just pretends that Reconstruction never happened and we're going to move on from this. It's really hard to say who was the big winner of this deal, But it's safe to say who the losers were, and the losers were the African Americans of the United States. Because within one election cycle, every single black who had been voted into office in the South was voted out, and all of the progress made towards trying to provide them with benefits and help were removed, and the Southern states were basically allowed to do what they wanted. It's really important to understand that Hayes was not at all aware of this deal. This was between the party leaders, not the party candidates, nor even the party members who were politicians. Hayes, as a result, faces a really hard presidency. The Democrats win control of the House of Representatives, and they make his life miserable. Additionally, even people within his own party view him as a fraud and that he was a cheat. Because remember, most of the party didn't know what went on. Hayes has a really hard time, but he does. I mean, he was going to pull the troops out of the South anyway, so that's not a stretch. He does appoint a Southerner to his cabinet. Appoints a Southern Democrat as the Postmaster General. Yeah, it's a pretty much useless title, but at least somebody got a job. He didn't say what job you're going to get, you're just going to get a job. And the Republicans in Congress agreed to send money to the South and agreed to help railroad lines run through the South to build a transcontinental railroad through there. The Democrats, with the control of the House, virtually make it impossible for Hayes to do much of anything. And he is regarded as a cheat and a fraud. He only serves one term, which was good for everybody, including him. Because the really sad part is, we'll talk about this in the next unit, he probably could have been a really good president if they had just given him a fair shake. But all right, that's it for today's Cavalcade of Whimsy. Peace and love.